fortunate to have so many types of musical expression in praising God. There's the fullness of the organ. There's times we have the clarity of a solo voice. And then other times the fullness of the choir, a flute. In our second service we'll have drums and guitars, so many different ways to express the love of God. And I love the fullness. I love each expression. It's beautiful. When I read the front of my Bible, 1962, it doesn't seem that long ago. I was with my sister and brother-in-law Friday evening, and my brother-in-law teaches at Wright State University, and he commented how his entering class were all born after 1995. Now, that doesn't seem so long ago. Neither does 1962. Well, one of the wonderful things is having lived a lot of different seasons and experienced a lot of different aspects of life. And to have had the opportunity to have the treasure of my life, Jesus, be the one to lead and influence and call me back time and time again, to let him be the light, the leader. During this past summer, we've talked about a lot of different interesting subjects. There's been violence, there's been sex, and this week there's money. All subjects that we can find hard to talk about, and yet things that pop up in the scripture and certainly in our lives. And so Jesus, to those who are gathered, he said, be careful about storing up treasures on earth where rust and moth can destroy. Now in Jesus' time, most of people's treasures were physical things. There weren't banks to hold your money. There weren't stocks to purchase. They were your things. And so often you handed on your clothes to the next generation, particularly your special garments. And so when Jesus said where rust and moth can destroy, the kind of things that people handed on to their descendants were items that could rust or destroy. Now, if Jesus were to say it again today, he might say, be careful about storing up treasures on earth, because it's going to end up on the stage of Fellowship Hall and go to the UMW rummage sale. Where is your treasure? What counts most in your life? What do you value? Where is your heart? Last Sunday and this Sunday have been important for me to think about end of life and actions of love. Around last week it was things medical, this week over things financial. And how do my end-of-life decisions take into account what are my biggest treasures? Now, the first will that Marty and I made out was when we started having children. And the way our first will read was that if Marty and I were to die, the children would get whatever financial wealth we had. And it wasn't going to be much at that point. There was a life insurance policy that we hoped would care for things. And that the children would be cared for by my oldest sister and her husband, Chris and Tom. Now, if we were all to die, it was to go to the United Methodist camps, because Marty and I met at the United Methodist camp, and we thought that'd be a great place to continue God's work into the future. This week, I called my middle daughter and was telling her what the subject of this morning was, and she said, "I really appreciated when I was a kid that you and Mom told us what would happen to us if you two died." Now, I can't remember when that conversation took place. I imagine it just kind of unfolded several times as they grew up. It could be we heard of a neighbor dying and we'd talk about those things as a family. But my daughter said that brought a lot of comfort as a young child to know things were set in place. She didn't have to worry about that. And she especially appreciated it when she was in high school. And a friend of hers, who was a sophomore in high school, mother was dying of cancer. Now, her mother was divorced. Her father lived in another town. And as her mother entered her last stages of cancer, she refused to talk with my daughter's friend and her little sister about what would happen after she died. And so when her mom died, there was a family fight over who would care for the children. And it was finally worked out after great legal expense that used up the funds that could have helped in the raising of these two children. It finally ended up that an uncle would care for them for the remainder of the school year in which they were in, and then they would have to move to another community to live with their father and with his new family. And so my daughter's friend lost her mother, lost her school, lost drama club, lost band, lost all her friends, and moved into a family that she did not know. In January, we're going to care for our middle daughter's children when they go on a cruise. So we'll have little Hannah and Ben for a week. And I said, I only have one request. You have to have a will done before you go. So we know what happens to Hannah and Ben if something happens. Now they've already asked a couple to care for them, my younger son and his wife, but it's not in writing. So they'll have that done. Our oldest daughter is married to a German citizen. They're the ones that have little Hans. And after today, they'll receive a letter with a copy of a sample will reminding them that they have to decide who will care for Hans and the baby that is coming. Because I don't want to be involved in an international lawsuit over who's going to care for their children. With language and custom barriers, no. How do we care for the treasures that God has entrusted to us? Now, a couple years ago, Marty and I made out a second will to make sure that we had a power of attorney for medical care, naming our oldest daughter to be in charge. Her eyes lit up a little too much when we told her. And to be clear on the division of resources that Marty and I have been able to accumulate, a trust from God. And And we've communicated that with our children, so there'll be no surprises. And it could well be the will need to change as we get older, as we enter a different season. But for now, it's clear, it's communicated. The Kiplinger Personal Finance magazine, from one of their summer issues, was commenting that 4 years ago, Wells Fargo Financial Services would receive from their branch agents, this was 4 years ago, 30 calls a month asking the home office and telling about concerns they had about some of their elderly clients and their ability to think well. That was 30 a month. Today, the home office gets 100 calls a month, over 3 times. The concerns around diminished mental ability and dementia and scams keeps growing. Daniel Marson, who's the director of the Alzheimer's Center at University of Alabama in Birmingham, said that the height of our financial decision-making power comes at age 53. Now, we may live in denial for quite a while, but that's what their research has found in brain studies, that the height of our financial, mental ability is age 53. I know it was in my dad's early 70s when I began going with him to see his stockbroker, where quarterly we would go over his assets and check what stocks he was investing in. He'd let me take a look at his checkbook to see how that was going, with an eye on how and if he was filing taxes. Of course, with Dad, when the dementia grew, he still let me check. But he wasn't too happy when I would point out, I think we're having some problems here. But we had talked about this stuff. And it had been clear that I was to be a loving son, and I was to say the difficult words when the time came. And so, though it wasn't pleasant, it was an act of love. And we were able to protect their resources through Dad's dementia. One of my daughters told me this week about a friend who's in her 30s, went to see her father who is dying. He made his will out 30 years ago. He has not updated it. Both she and her brother are supposed to go to their aunt when her dad passes away. Of course, they're 30 and they will not go. But also, he has as the executor of his will his father, who is 93 and has dementia. How is that going to go? It may all work out very well, but it also could get quite ugly. How are you caring for your treasure? The treasure that God has entrusted to you in this lifetime. Now, it can be complicated. There was one couple in the Cincinnati area back in the 1800s who left some funds to what was called the Cincinnati District of the United Methodist Church to set up an endowment
for the ongoing care of the gospel wagon that served the Cincinnati area. It was a wagon drawn by horses that would take scripture throughout the neighborhoods, and there would be preaching in different neighborhoods and gathering of children, and they'd give out Bibles. And that worked really well for the care and feeding of the horses. Until the automobile came. And then the day arose when they no longer had the gospel wagon drawn by horses. And no one knew what to do with that endowment, because it was very specific for the care of the horses. Well, finally, back in the 1990s, they decided maybe we can do something different with this. And they bought a bus to go around to the different neighborhoods and have vacation Bible school in the different neighborhoods. I think very much keeping with the intent of the family back in the 1800s in a way they never could have imagined. It can be complicated in other ways. I have a friend in his 80s who has had no conversation with his children about end-of-life matters. Between he and his wife, this is a second marriage for both of them, they have 6 children. Of those 6 children, they're all adults. One is living in a group home because of a severe bipolar situation. One child is horrible at handling money. 2 of the children were in a Christian cult at one time. 3 of the children are not talking to each other. And so, he has done nothing. Which I can understand because it's highly problematic. But if he does nothing, will there be more or less problems for the family after he dies? I would say many more problems. Ripe for conflict and misunderstanding, unnecessary legal fees. In my own extended family, there was one couple who decided to leave out one of their children in the will. It leaves an emotional and relational mess. If you find that you're hesitant to talk about these things, that's very natural. In a study done by the California Healthcare Foundation, over 50% of people do not talk about end-of-life decisions with their children. That's natural. But is it good? Is it healthy? One of the traits of families that don't work well together is that they don't talk. Talking is one of the traits of healthy families. It brings health into the family. Jesus talked about light coming into darkness. Secrecy and non-talk is what fosters the darkness to grow. Conversation and bringing the values of Jesus fosters the light. Now, there was one man at St. Andrews who did this. He used to sit in the back. He was very nondescript. He died back in 1976 at the age of 90. And here is his story.
You hear these stories over the years, and you wonder how much of it is truth, how much of it actually happened, how much of it is just legend that's grown over the years.
He saw things that the rest of us maybe didn't see at that time. He was truly a visionary. He was our role model. That's why I call him the father of philanthropy.
Everybody thinks, boy, I'd like to have lots of money someday, but really, what do you do once you've got it? That's the next step, and that's not always an easy thing to deal with. I think Dale Dorney discovered that and was kind of obsessed by that thought. I'm 30, 31, 32. I had just gone into office. I think in 1974 or 75 when I first heard his name mentioned. He used to spend a lot of time up at probate court. He'd come up and he'd just spend hours pouring through these cases, seeing the people's will. I had a fascination regarding people's estates and how they left their money. And all of a sudden I became familiar with Dale Dorney. He's been part of my life ever since. Lived down on East Lima Street here in Findlay. I think he's very quiet, but very, very unassuming man. He had over his dining room table, he had like a single bowl that what he'd eat by, and he had just a little spoon that he always used the same spoon, the same cup, and I think he was the most unlikely person ever to be that people would not be talking about 25, 30 years after he died.
He was a very private man, very frugal, but I think he wanted to save money because he had a purpose, he had a mission.
He'd subscribe to the Wall Street Journal and take all these stocks and analyze them. He was one of the first investors in IBM back when people had never heard of the company. And it developed into about $10, $15 million, which was just absolutely huge money back in those days. And he didn't have anybody to leave it to. He was never married, he never had any children. And I think he really went, what do you do when you've got all that money?
Dale was one of 4 children and all the other children died. His mother died, his father died when he was young. This had to have an impact. I think while he was taking care of business, it would be hard to separate that from, this is my life, this is the end of my family.
And I think that he was almost obsessed by that thought about, what best can I do with this money? Earning it is sometimes the easy part. It's what you do with it after you've earned it is the real challenge, particularly when you don't have, a wife and children to leave it to. So I think that was one of his real obsessions. Dale worked for Hancock Brick and Tile Company at the time. Asked his employer if it would be okay if I just take a year leave of absence. And he said, well, I'm sure. Is it health related or what is it? He said, well, no. He said, I'd like to work on my will. He took a year off and did nothing but sit down and compose this, I'd say, a masterpiece about how he wanted his estate to be divided. Very poetic. It reads like a novel.
Its sustenance to the hands of others. The execution of this will is committed. May the divine spirit guide them. Our earthly possessions are, after all, but life holdings, and the grace judged with charity.
Well, I'm not suggesting you take a year off. We all have treasures. We all have treasures. And these last 2 weeks have given us an opportunity to think about how we care for these treasures. For Christ, for the people in our lives. With our very final decisions that we have in our final seasons of life. It's an act of discipleship. Jesus leads us into a life of love. It's not just for the beginning seasons of life, for the middle seasons, but it's for the end seasons as well. And I loved how Dale Dorney said it. And the grace with which we depart with them shows the heart in the least disguised form. It echoes Jesus. Where our treasure is, there will our heart be also. So through all our life, may Christ's light shine.
I'll comment a little bit about where we have come from and what we're trying to accomplish today. We started with a committee back in October of last year, and our charge was to look at stewardship and legacy. We've done that. We have worked on the process. And in order to come up with a plan, we looked back and noticed that the Living Stones project was quite successful. And it was successful because of the leadership we had, along with the congregation. It couldn't have been accomplished without the congregation. So with that in mind, we went back to Generis, the company that helped us with the Living Stones project. And the person that did that is here today, and I'd like for him to stand, Larry Armitrout. We appreciated his efforts before, and we certainly appreciate his efforts now. Because we're at this point, we've had legacy meetings. Some of you were here for last Sunday's program, and I explained the legacy side of it. Today we're going to be looking at the financial side and getting involved with wills and trusts. And what I would like to do now is have our committee stand up and be recognized, because they put in a lot of hard work, and we're at the point where it would be good to recognize them. So would the committee that's here please stand up? That would be Patty Lucas is here. Yep. Suzanne Thompson. John Nyes in the back. Charles Lyons couldn't be here today, but he was very, very helpful in a lot of the decisions we needed to make. Dave here. Dave's here. Pastor Larry was on the committee as well. We appreciate his efforts for sure. Let's see. Okay. At any rate, what we have realized is that there are about 63% of the people that should have a will do not have a will. And that's hard to believe. That's a statistic that we've seen. We have a person here today who's going to talk to us about the situation of wills and trusts. And so I want to introduce Reverend George Cooper, Executive Director Council of Development at the West Ohio United Methodist Church. And so he's going to lead the program this morning. And I'd like to have Pastor Larry, if he would, please come over and say a prayer so that we can get started.
Yeah, Larry and Trish Miles have headed up this whole thing. You know, they talked about all their committee members, but the Miles have gone extra miles in helping with this. So let's thank Larry and Trish. Hey, let's pray. Lord, thank you. Thank you for all the treasures you give us. So many different kinds, so many different seasons of our lives. Thank you for those gifts that are so extravagantly strewn throughout our lifetime. And Lord, we offer you what you've given us, that we might be good stewards in every season, in the care of our children, in the care of neighbors, in the care of siblings, of parents. May we take good care. And with the financial treasures that you've bestowed on us, may we be wise. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thanks, Larry. Good morning. Good morning. Helen Juby. None of you have ever heard of Helen Juby, but she will be a lady that will always be imprinted on my mind and heart for my entire lifetime. I went to a church, and one of the first persons I met was Helen Juby. Helen Juby was 82 years old. She was married, lived on 10 acres, had an acre flower garden, had a 1 acre vegetable garden, took care of it all by hand with a hoe. She played tennis 3 days a week. She was chair of the Goodwill Board for the Summit County, which is the county around Akron. She was one of those vibrant ladies that you looked at her and all you could think of was, what a classy person. What a model for me. And so she became the matriarch of the church I was serving at the time, and how she ties into legacies is, after I had been at the church for about a year, and the finance committee did their usual thing, and there was always this line under memorial funds that was about $6,000, undesignated, no purpose, and the finance committee kept saying, we ought to do something with that, we ought to do something with that. And one day, Helen Juby asked me to come over to her house, and she said, George, you know, this church does not have an endowment to think about the long-term future. It's time that we do. We have a little bit of seed money, but it's not enough. If you will let me, as chair of the administrative council, I would like to donate $25,000 added to that $6,000 to establish an endowment fund. And as we establish that endowment fund, let's make sure that it has a chance to grow to a substantial size so that it has a long-term benefit for the church. And so she ended up donating that $25,000. She helped us go through the process of setting up the resolution for an endowment committee. And she received an inheritance of well over $1 million. And guess what Helen Juby did? She tithed 10% of that estate gift and put it into the endowment fund. So the first $125,000 of that small churches, when I first arrived, they had about 50 in worship. The first $125,000 in their endowment came from Helen Juby, and then some other funds began to trickle in as individuals remember the church and their estate. And one of the things I want you to notice is, and when we think about a living legacy, we're thinking about legacy in the sense of 50 years from now, we've created a legacy about what I have donated that makes an ongoing legacy about who I am as a person, but it's still alive because it continues to perpetuate mission and ministry in the life of the church. You can't overemphasize that. An endowment is not a rainy day fund for when you need it someday. It's for today to perpetuate what we're striving to do to make disciples of Jesus Christ. And so Helen Juby had done that. So now the first 125 came from her, and then several other gifts came along, and then she passed away And she left half of her estate to her husband and the other half of her estate to the church, his endowment program. And so another $500,000 came into the estate, into the endowment program of the church that I was serving at the time. So just think about what Helen Juvie accomplished in teaching a young pastor about the importance of a legacy for the long-term future, where her legacy is, I'm still talking about the stewardship of Helen Juvie, and I'm still talking about how she taught a young pastor about the importance of thinking about the long-term future of the church and the benefit for making disciples of Jesus Christ within the life of the church. Helen Juvie taught me about endowments and legacies for the long-term future of the church. As a result, much of what I talk about today comes from and is a result of my experience with Helen Juvie. I'm thrilled that you're having a Living Legacy campaign. Too many churches focus on the capital improvement campaigns, and you've done so and you had a successful campaign, but you've moved beyond that and you're thinking about the future. And I just want to commend the leadership of this church for thinking about the long-term future of the church and providing for the legacy with endowments and foundations to perpetuate the mission of the church. You're going to hear me say that over and over again. If you get tired of it, too bad. Now, a legacy builds on the foundation of stewardship, and it's very important for us to remember, again, we're not just putting funds aside for a rainy day. We're thinking about the stewardship, the management of all of the gifts that God gives to us individually, as well as the stewardship of the leadership of the church, of the assets that God gives to the church, and being stewards of those resources as well. So we're building on stewardship. Now, stewardship's a lifestyle. What do most people think of when they think of stewardship? They think of what? What's the one word? Money. Now, somebody said the tithe. Most people don't think of the tithe because in one church I went to, when I started talking about how they could get out of their financial crisis and I used the word tithe, they said that's a four-letter word around here. T-I-T-H. Tiff. How's that a problem? Anyhow, a lot of people don't think of tithe, they think of just money. That's that time of year when people are going to ask us for money. When in reality, stewardship is a lifestyle. It's synonymous in the Greek with manage. And it means that we are managers of all of the gifts that God gives to us. And think about the gifts that God gives to you. We often think of money, yes, but what about life? What about relationships? Your children, your spouse, the talents that you have that enable you to have a career, that enables you to have a comfortable lifestyle and be able to have a car that brings you to church and takes you to work and takes you to the movies and go to restaurants and go visit family that's now living out in Oklahoma, and to be able to do all of those kinds of things. It's also the gift of the environment and taking care of the environment. And the most precious gift of all that I believe that's been given to me personally happened on Easter 1973, when at 3 o'clock in the morning I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. The most precious gift that's been given to me is God's gift, for God so loved the world that He gave His Son. And that's the most precious gift that God has given to me. So when we think of stewardship, we need to think holistically about all of God's gifts and how do we manage all of those gifts, and not just think about what am I going to put on the plate on Sunday morning. It's about how I use all of those as good managers for the advancement of the mission of Christ's church. Now, and you'll notice at the bottom of this slide it says, however, possibly the most difficult. Now I'm going to do a Cooperism of Martin Luther. Martin Luther said there needs to be a conversion of the mind so you understand the gospel, conversion of the heart so you accept the gospel, and now the most difficult of all, a conversion of the wallet so we live the gospel. It has been proven in research that discipleship stops when an individual is unwilling to allow God to have control of their assets as well as the rest of their lives. We accept Christ. We see the importance of going to church. We see the importance of serving on committees or being part of a small group. We see the importance of participating in other aspects of the life of the church. But the one place where our discipleship, our walk with Christ begins to stall is when we come to that place of money. And does God have control over my money? After all, I like my stuff. I just got myself an Apple 5S. I've been holding on to an Apple 4 for 2 years, and it was time to step up. And now as soon as I get that, I see they now have a 6. I'm still trying to figure this one out, so don't worry, I'm not going out and getting a 6. But we like our stuff, so we want all the latest in our cars, and we want all the latest in our homes, and we want all the latest in this and the latest in that. And we like our stuff, so we have difficulty letting God have control of our stuff, i.e. the money that buys that stuff. But that's an important part of our stewardship, is when we allow God to have control of our entire lives, remembering that we're called to be stewards, managers of all aspects of our lives, including our assets. Now, this comes from the Giving USA, 2013, $335 billion were given to charities in 2013. 335,000. Now I want you to notice that 72% of that came from individuals. 72% came from individuals. That's the widow that gives $5 a month, who's on Social Security, to the individual that's able to make a $1 million contribution to a church capital campaign, or a $10 million contribution to the university of their choice so that they can see the George Cooper Building of Sciences. I'm a math physics major, so that's why I picked out sciences. So it comes from individuals. Now, when I look at this chart, as a math physics major, you would think I'd be focused on the numbers. I do not see numbers. I see hearts. When 72% of all charitable giving comes from individuals, that tells me that by being created in God's image, I have a desire and a hunger to be like God, which means that I have the capacity in being created in God's image to have intelligence, to have creativity, to love, to forgive, and for so loved the world that God gave His only begotten Son. I have a hunger, and every human being on this earth, as a child of God, has a hunger to be generous. That 72% tells me there is a hunger in our hearts to be generous. Now, there's some other information that is interesting that comes out of this chart that we'll look at briefly. Some trends since 2009. Individual giving dropped for the first time in 100 years from 75% to 72%. Now, part of the reason for that is we've become more sophisticated in how we give. Therefore, a lot of individuals have started to set up individual family foundations. And if I were to go back, you would notice that foundations attributed for 15% of all charitable giving. A large percentage of those are individual family foundations, not corporations or people like the Gates Foundation, but individuals. Another learning is that corporations grew from 4% to 5%. Well, part of the reason is they have better cash flow right now because they're holding back waiting for the economy to improve. So they're giving more to charitable organizations. Foundations grew from 13% to 15%. Part of the reason for that is more and more individuals are setting up family foundations. I spoke with a brother and a sister recently about a contribution to Imagine No Malaria, the initiative of the West Ohio Conference, about a contribution from their family foundation that's been in place for about 15 years and has set up a foundation at Methesco Theological School as well as through the West Ohio Conference for clergy leadership development. and it came from the family foundation. Now, one of the things that I would encourage you to take note that's of interest is the one area that is flat in charitable giving is through bequests. To me, that's very intriguing at a time when more and more nonprofits are looking at how can we get those alumni and those people affiliated with our school, with our hospital, etc., to remember us in their estate. And when you look at the percentage, the largest percentage of charitable giving is to religious causes, I think one of the reasons it's flat is because the church has been, shall I use the word negligent, or at least passive in its efforts in encouraging individuals to remember the church and their estate planning. And that's one reason it's been flat. Now, religious giving, I want you to take note. In 1985, religious giving to all charitable causes was 53%. And in 2011, it dropped to 32%. Now, what are some of the reasons for that? Some of the reasons include that churches are less and less inclined to ask for money, and if you don't ask, you don't receive. Secondly, the number of nonprofits in this country has grown by about 200 to 300% in the last 10 years. So there's more people asking. And during the Great Recession, individuals, if the church was not involved in human service kinds of ministries, they began to give to human services rather than to the local church because they themselves had a job, but their friends and family didn't. So they switched their charitable giving from the church to human services that were providing food and clothing and utility assistance and rent and those kinds of things. And that's one of the reasons for the drop in giving to religious causes. So, the application of all of this is that pastors and church leaders need to develop a culture of generous giving to the local church and their first mile giving. What do I mean by first mile giving? That's the money that I give on Sunday morning to sustain the operation of the mission base of the church, i.e., somebody used that four-letter word, tithe. When we give to the church, we're sustaining the mission base to be able to make disciples of Jesus Christ, and to do so in word, i.e., sharing who is Jesus Christ. And secondly, indeed, by providing food and clothing and the assistance necessary for individuals to be able to feel loved by the church so that they're receptive to hear the message of the church. So some individuals need the deeds first. So, we're called in generous giving to give to the church first. That's an Old Testament principle. We'll look at it a little bit more in just a few moments. The pastor and leadership needs to embrace generosity as a lifestyle with the increasing number of nonprofits courageously asking and inviting individuals to give to kingdom causes. Why is it that we pastors, Larry's not in this group, by the way, but I know of pastors that will sit in their church and they'll look at declining revenue and having trouble making ends meet, and then they'll see in the newspaper that a member of theirs gave $1 million to the local hospital, and yet that individual is giving the church $2,500 a year. And they'll grouse, is that an okay word in the church? Grouse? Okay. They'll grouse about how that individual gave so much to the hospital and gives so little to the church, but they've never been out and met the individual and spent time with them and asked them to step up in their giving. We as church leaders and pastors need to become more courageous and being willing to ask individuals, invite individuals to give to kingdom causes in the life of the church. That's for the sustaining of the mission base, i.e. the tithe on Sunday morning, but above and beyond that for things like the capital campaign you had, and then above and beyond that for estate planning. Thus, you're having your Living Legacy campaign. Pastors and church leaders need to incorporate generosity as an eternal lifestyle with legacy invitations, and that's what we're all about today. Now, I show you this pyramid of giving just to illustrate the importance of understanding that there's this whole range and base of individuals who are potential donors, and it moves its way up as some people give the first time, and then they begin to give consistently, and then they give to major gifts, like with your capital campaign that you have recently, and then a small percentage of individuals will remember nonprofits, specifically the church. A smaller percentage will remember those nonprofits in their estate planning. And part of what's important to see on this chart is the need for a larger percentage of individuals to remember nonprofits in their estate planning. There is a mindset among many of us that if I don't leave everything to my kids, I'm not doing what's right for my children. When in reality, if our kids are successful and already working and very successful, should I not be thinking about my estate from the principle of the tithe as well, and tithing a percentage of my estate? And when I say tithe, I'm not legalistic and saying 10%. There's a degree at which we have to think about what percentage of my estate might I leave. So we move along. Biblical stewardship and planned giving, stewardship of assets with the estate. I'm going to set this down for just a second because I want to grab my Bible, because I want to read a couple of passages for you. As the people of Israel had moved from Egypt, and they had moved and they had traveled around the peninsula of Sinai for about 40 years because of the golden calf issue, they finally are moving into the promised land. And we will note that the duties of the priests and Levites is described, and God is telling the Levites the following. And then the Lord said to Aaron, I myself have put you in charge of the offerings presented to me, all the holy offerings the Israelites give me. I give to you and your sons as your portion and your regular share. That regular share was 10%. The Levites were to receive that 10% to sustain the mission base, i.e., the income by which the priests, i.e. the Levites, were able to eat and to clothe themselves, but also to sustain the temple and to live upon. But then notice a little bit later on in Numbers 18, it states, the Lord said to Aaron, you will have no inheritance in their land, nor will you have any share among them. They didn't receive the inheritance of the land because they were to receive the inheritance from the other 11 tribes. As the Levites received the gifts from individuals for decades and centuries to come, they didn't need the inheritance of the land. The inheritance of the land was given to the other 11 tribes, and then they, those other tribes were expected to give the 10% to the Levites. So you have a portion at which you're sustaining the mission base, i.e. your regular giving on a Sunday morning, as well as the inheritance of the land, i.e. the legacy giving that we're talking about this morning. It's modeled from the very beginning when the nation of Israel was established. We have other examples in the scriptures of individuals that practice legacy giving. Barnabas took land that he owned as part of the early church in Acts 4, and he sold that land and he brought it to the disciples and gave it to the disciples, and that was his legacy gift to the early church, which was then used to support the early church. The other example would be from 2 Corinthians 8, where it talks so much about the grace of the Macedonian church, where Paul is comparing the Macedonian church to the Corinthian church, telling the Corinthian church to step up in their giving, and the Macedonian church, Paul states that they had given beyond their means. They had moved beyond just giving out of the tithe, but they had moved into their legacy giving to the point of Paul could not stop them from giving. They were giving so much. Legacy giving. It's modeled for us throughout the scripture. Estate planning, I heard Larry use the figure 63%. I've seen 55. Either way, when 55 to 63% of adult Americans do not have a will, that indicates huge issues for those families in the months and years to come. 3 reasons why individuals don't leave an estate gift. First of all, a lot of us think the process is too expensive and too complicated. We think we're going to have to get an attorney and spend hundreds of dollars to set up an elaborate estate. In reality, I did a presentation similar to this at a church recently, and one of the chairs of the campaign just went on legal Zoom and filled out a will for $63. Won't break too many of us. With over 55 to 63% of individuals not having a will, it's very important we recognize and acknowledge and tell all ages the importance of having a will. And it's not that expensive and it's not that complicated. And we'll look at some implications of that in just a moment. The other reason that individuals avoid estate planning is they really don't want to consider their own mortality. My dad had his first will when he was 74. He passed away at 76. He didn't want to face his mortality. My mother had died a few years earlier. Luckily, she had gone to an attorney on her own and set up her own will to make sure that matters were taken care of on her part. But my dad did not want to face his mortality. I can remember at one point being in this work, asking my dad if he had completed his will and looked at it recently, and he said, "What will?" And I said, "Dad, you really need to have a will to make sure that your wishes are complied by. You know, it's going to be very difficult for my sister and brother and myself to figure out what you want to do with your estate. And besides, do you want to give it all to the government? Wouldn't you prefer to leave it to family or at least a charitable cause?" And he said, "I don't want to think about it." And I said, "A will's not that complicated." He said, "No, that's not what I don't want to think about." And I said, "You know, Dad, the day's going to come when you're not going to be with us anymore." "I don't want to think about it," and covered his ears, and he started blah, 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 blah. Didn't want to hear a word about it. He didn't want to face his mortality. Some individuals primarily say it's just procrastination. They haven't gotten around to doing it. Therefore, by having this event, you're bringing it to the forefront of encouraging individuals to have an estate. Set up a will at least. Now, estate planning includes all assets, benefits, property, and payments that can be transferred to someone else at the time of our passing. That's pretty straightforward. It includes all assets and benefits and property that can be passed along. When you're planning your estate, it's important to list all your assets and forms of ownership and make sure that you have a list of all of those. I have a son that I have some collectibles that has told me that he wants his name put on the bottom of them. And I said, "Is it my choice, not yours?" And he said, "Not really." You have to know my son to understand him. He and I laughed about it, but he doesn't know his name is not on the bottom of them. You have to decide on your beneficiaries, the amounts, the method of distribution. We'll talk more. It's important to get professional advice. I'm not a professional. I served as a pastor for 25 years. Then I did capital campaigns across the country for 10 years. And then now I do this kind of work. I'm not a professional. I can tell you about different vehicles and tools you can use, but you need to talk to a professional about your unique situation and how best to do so. And why I say it's important to talk to a professional, I speak from experience, having an aunt who did not want to face her mortality, did not fill out a will, had quite a few accumulated assets that she inherited from her mother, as well as being a single school teacher. She accumulated these assets and lived simply. She also inherited a 4-story rooming house in Chautauqua, New York, with a lake view.
Oh my.
Anybody that knows anything about Chautauqua knows about property values. You can move right outside the gate, and the same building would have been worth 100th of what it was valued at. and they valued it at $999,998 because they wanted to stay below the $1 million mark for the impact on the estate. And they got the full asking price. Now the dilemma was, my aunt had not faced her mortality, and so she finally did a will when her brother, who was an attorney, came in town and said, you need to have a will. He filled it out and made it out for her. She had told me all along she wanted to make sure the rooming house that had been in the family for 150 years stayed in the family. He didn't want that included because he had 3 daughters. Think about $999,000 and 3 daughters. And you want to keep this in the family. So if you're going to leave it to somebody who's going to get it versus who's going to get the assets of the $999,000 plus the other assets. As a result, a will was filled out about a month before she died. I wanted to purchase the house at the tax appraised value, as did my sister. I had 7 cousins and 1 brother that threatened to take me to court. It's very important for us to be looking at what my wishes, and in this particular case with my aunt, professional advice that was not family should have been filling out the estate plans for her. So it just illustrates the importance of what are my wishes and making sure they're written down, not just spoken, but also seeking professional advice on how best to set up the estate. And then it's, once the plan is completed, it's very important to review it every couple of years. Did you know for the 90% of Americans who have a will, and when they pass away, they've completed their last will and testament 2 years before they passed away? You heard some examples from Pastor Larry about individuals that filled out something 50 years ago with the illustration of the endowment for the gospel wagon, and then the changes to be able to change that endowment to move to the bus. We need to evaluate, do the circumstances when I filled out that estate, do they still apply today as much as they did back then when I first filled it out? I've gone through 3 revisions. I'm nowhere near that point, I hope, of being 2 years from my passing. I hope. But that's in God's plan. So it's very important to review it on a regular basis. And if you haven't looked at your estate plans in the last couple of years, I encourage you to seek the professional advice and to do so. There's tax implications, obviously income taxes, estate taxes, gift taxes, generation skipping taxes. There's all kinds of things out there that can complicate matters if you don't have a professional advice to be able to set up your estate in such a way to minimize taxes. So who benefits? The charity you want to give to and your family. That's who you want to benefit, not the government. And if there are ways to do so, do so. Of course you want to do it legally, but it's very important to recognize that there's implications for all of these. Avoid common mistakes. All I need is a simple will. Well, it depends on what you have. And for some individuals, it also depends on who you're related to. And the perception of the competency of your children and or the competency of the charity that you may want to leave the funds to. So it's very important to recognize that a simple will may not be adequate. In some cases, you need to be looking at assorted other vehicles such as trusts. Joint ownership will avoid all problems and all taxes? Not necessarily. Make sure everything is evaluated by a professional so that you make sure you do not set up your spouse up to be in a situation where they no longer have control over the assets necessary to live on as the estate goes through probate. It's very important to make sure those things are taken care of. Any attorney can draft my will. Not necessarily. Not with the professionalism that some of you may require based on the complexities of your circumstances. Family members pass away in logical order. Well, not necessarily. We all know of circumstances where you would expect the husband to go first, but the wife does, or we expect the children to go out to survive their parents. It doesn't always work that way, so you always need to incorporate into your plans a backup. What happens if? What if my child were to precede me in passing? Do I have plans for an alternate beneficiary? I've already given to the church. When we give weekly, we may think that as a result, I don't need to think about the church and my estate plan. Well, how many people here have a pension or a 401k? Most of you. Over the last few years, has it grown a little bit? Just a little? I think it's done fairly well of recent. Now, the increased valuation of the amount of that pension and or 401k, you have not been tithing. If you're a tither, you haven't been tithing on the increased value of what that is. Or those funds that you set aside might have been tax-free, and you may be one of those individuals that believes in tithing on the net. By the way, when people ask me, do you tithe on net or gross? I'm not sure I should tell you my answer. Typically, I say, I don't care. Pick one. It's probably better than you're already doing. If you're going to use that line, you better make sure you know them pretty well. But anyhow, if we're tithing on the gross, okay, you might have covered the amount that you made at that particular time, but what about the growth that's taken place since then? In addition to that, it simply comes down to, I have these assets, it's nearing the end of my life, and am I remembering that body of the church that has sustained my faith, visited me and talked to me in difficult times in life, provided ministries for my children so that they were baptized and confirmed and married, has made a difference in my community, impacted the lives of my children, then all of those kinds of things, have I remembered that place that sustained me in my faith and helped me to grow in my understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ? Have I done so? Even if I have tithed on the gross, and I've tithed on the income made during the last couple of years as the market's done better, even if I have tithed on that, do I remember the benefit of what the church has done for me and my family and the people I love? Barna Research. Number one reason that individuals will give to a charitable cause: they benefit other people, the people I care about. Number two reason, they benefit me. Number three reason, they have fiscal integrity, and I know the way they manage my funds will be used in such a way that it's good stewardship and is used in a way that's above reproach. Additional lifetime planning considerations: a living will or a do not resuscitate. Do you want the doctors making those decisions for you? Don't you want someone that you love that knows what your wishes are to be able to do so? I've known of legal cases that have gone on and on and on, while the medical bills have grown and grown and grown, when an individual wanted to not be put on some kind of life support. So that's an important part of it. Healthcare power of attorney. Who's going to make decisions about when certain things need to be done if I'm not capable of doing so? HIPAA designation. Who has access to my medical information? Do my children have access? I have to sign a form that gives access to information about my medical condition for my wife to know what's going on with me, for my children to know. And if you want them to be making decisions for your medical health too, could be medical health, wouldn't you like them to know the history and have access to that information? Financial power of attorney. Who's going to pay the bills if I'm not capable of doing so? Some people think it's just about where I'm going to leave my money. These are equally, if not more important, especially for someone that's younger. and assorted trust instruments, and I may want to do something special for my brother-in-law. When he passed away, was a multimillionaire, and he set up a trust where my nieces receive X number of dollars a month that they could use for spending money, and above and beyond that, they have to go to the trust custodian if they're going to buy a house or spend something that's above and beyond the amount that they receive on a monthly basis. Because he did not trust them to make their own decisions until they were 45. Now, hopefully you have greater confidence in your children to be able to make decisions before that. But I will say in one case, he should have said 65. No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. Forgive me. Charitable giving, 3 kinds of gifts, outright gifts. There is nothing wrong with thinking about planned giving. Any gift that you plan to give is a planned gift. So there is the opportunity to do planned giving today. You don't have to wait, and it's just part of estate planning. You may have a stock that you purchased 30, 40, 50 years ago that has grown significantly, and you need a tax deduction, and you want to do something for the church. You can donate that stock, and therefore it can go into the endowment, one of the endowments, or into the foundation, and it can be accumulating assets, benefiting the ministry, and in the meantime, you don't have to pay any taxes on the capital gain, but you've still done something that's benefited the church. You can do bequests or trust distributions, and then income retained gifts. We'll look at those in a moment. So, types of assets that can be gifted: cash, appreciated financial security, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, IRAs. For those of you that have IRAs that have not yet done your distribution for the year, that's mandatory if you're over 70 and a half, hold on to it for a while. Don't take it yet. We're still waiting to see what Congress is going to do, and you know they're notorious for passing bills December the 30th and saying it's retroactive. So you could have used that distribution directly to the church and not had to pay any income tax on it. They're still working on it. It's passed the House, and I'm not going to get into politics, but now it's got to go through the Senate. Senate's in favor of it, they just don't want to talk about it. Have I already said too much? I better move along. So if you have an IRA and you're required to take a distribution, if you are able to do so, hold on to it until the end of the year to see what Congress is going to do with that possibility that can be the means by which you make your charitable contribution to the church or some other charitable organization. Life insurance, obviously, that's a nice way of being able to give a gift that never goes through probate. It goes directly to the organization. So that's something for you to consider. You may have a life insurance policy now that you have enough other assets that your spouse won't need that. Change the beneficiary. It may already be paid for. Change the beneficiary. Real estate, you can leave property. Now, common sense. If you own property that once was a gas station, please don't leave it to the church. By the time EPA is done, the church is going to put out more money than you've left them. I once had an individual call me and say they wanted to leave their church a timeshare. We won't go there. Please don't. You can leave valuables, jewelry, art. Just make sure they're worth something, not what you think they're worth, because they have to be appraised. And there are tax laws related to if you take a tax deduction, the church can't do anything with it if they can't sell it for the appraised value. So as a result, as an example, I had an individual donate a yacht to a campaign I was working. It was valued at $450,000. The most they could get was $250,000. They had to hold on to it and maintain it. And the fees involved for 3 years for the individual to get the full $450,000 deduction. In the 3 years, they're paying fees. I asked the question, how many parties did you throw on the yacht to raise more money to pay for maintaining it? Oh, gee, we never thought of that. I would have had a party a month on that boat to be able to pay for the fees. But anyhow, there's all kinds of valuables. I once had a colleague that had a contribution to a church campaign of a rhino. a rhinoceros. You heard me right. They had a private zoo. They donated it. It was valued at $25,000. They couldn't find a buyer. The individual said that they would take care of the rhino. In this case, it was okay because they were willing to take care of the rhino until they were able to find a buyer. In the meantime, that individual was looking to buy a new rhino to put in the zoo. The cheapest one they could find was for $35,000. Well, why go through the cost of transporting one rhino from one place to another and transporting the new one back to you? So we just gave you $35,000 and bought it back. Worked out for the church. But it illustrates weird things that people will try to leave to the church. So you really need to think about, if you're going to leave a valuable of some sort to the church, make sure you have a conversation with the church about whether they want to accept it or not. Because there may be costs involved to the church that as a result, they would say no, because of the fees that might be involved. So there's all kinds of things that we can leave that we never think about as assets that we could leave to the church. I know of one individual that left a baseball that was signed by Mickey Mantle. $25,000 on eBay. Look in your basement. You'll be amazed at what you might have. Planned gifts, charitable gift annuities. This is an income retained gift where you pay, and well, I'll review that in just a moment. Charitable remainder trust, charitable leave trust. These are ways of leaving to a charity to provide ongoing income and or a residual at the end of a person's life. Life insurance, retirement plan benefits. There's multiple vehicles that are combined together. A unit trust where the income from the trust is used to not only provide an income for the individual, but buy an insurance policy which then provides for the children when the person passes away. Thus, the benefit is for the children as well as for the charity, as well as income for the individual during the remainder of their life. There are vehicles that are out there like that. But again, seek professional advice, not George Cooper. Ways to make charitable bequests of giving a specific dollar amount, giving a specific asset, giving a percentage of the assets passing under your will, giving all or part of what's left, providing for survivors first before the gift is made. You determine how you want that set up. Just make sure you think it through and get the professional advice on what's going to be the best tax advantage for the individual as well as for the charity. And you may think, well, gee, if I leave $100,000 today to the St. Andrews United Methodist Church, that's a lot of money. Well, what if you live another 25 years? How much is that $100,000 worth? Is it worth the same amount? So you may want to think percentage, but that's your choice, based on your knowledge of your estate and seeking professional advice. Charitable gift annuity, a contribution is made to a charity. A contract is established where you receive based on your age and the percentage, which is established by the American Council on Annuities, a percentage where an individual that's in their 80s can receive 6 or 7%. Is that better than a CD? Duh. So they can get 6 or 7%. For the remainder of their life, they receive X number of dollars per month. And then when they pass away, whatever is left goes to the charity. So the benefit is for me, for additional income, as well as leaving something for the charitable. Also, in the beginning, a percentage of that is a charitable deduction, the income, a portion of which is tax-free for X number of years based on your life expectancy. You have a brochure about that on your table. I think I've covered up there everything that's up there except to say that they can be done for 1 life or for 2 lives, and it's set up on the basis of the youngest life. And those are some examples from a person at age 60 at 4.4% up to 90 and above, which goes over 7%. Deferred charitable gift annuities, the percentage increases because you may be able to contribute to it and add to the value, and or it continues to accumulate assets, and it's based on your age at the time that you start to take distributions. And the reason I'm bringing up charitable gift annuities and deferred charitable gift annuities, some individuals that think about estate planning are thinking, well, but I need the income now. I don't know what I'm going to have left over. Well, this is one way of being able to have some assets and income now while also remembering the church in your estate planning. Stewardship of estate gifts. Church stewardship of estate assets, it's essential that you have confidence in the life of the church and the way that the endowment and the foundation is being managed. And it's very important, if you have questions about management of those vehicles of the endowment or the foundation, that you talk to the individuals that are in charge of those. Make sure you understand how they're being managed, how they're invested, how the distributions take place. Make sure you're confident. You have confidence. Don't make assumptions. Church leadership stewardship of planned gifts for designated purposes. If you came to the leadership of the endowment committee and said, I want to leave a gift for XYZ and I don't see it here, I'm sure they would be more than glad to talk to you. Endowments are, and I said this in the very beginning, and again you're going to hear it, endowments are for mission and ministry. It's not for a rainy day. So as you're leaving gifts for an endowment through an estate gift, remember, it's going to be used for the purpose that you designate and or the fund that you place it in to perpetuate the mission and ministry of the St. Andrew's United Methodist Church. You have 3 different funds: the Memorial Endowment Fund, the Memorial for Family and Friends, and it's used for specific purposes unless designated otherwise. Custodial Endowment Fund for building and facilities, and the Foundation Fund that's used for foundations or used for operations unless you designate otherwise. Make sure you learn about these funds and how they can be utilized to tie into your estate planning. And I believe you've received some brochures about some of that information, so make sure you study it, and you understand it, and set it up the way that, in an area that you might have a passion or an interest. It's also possible to set up individual endowment funds, where you set up your own endowment fund and it's used for a specific purpose. I just beg of you, if you're going to do an individual endowment fund, make sure it's for something that can have long-term benefit to the life of the church. I had to work with a church that had an individual that set up an individual endowment fund for a new steeple. The church had just been built with no plans for a steeple. They left $25,000 in the endowment. To redesign the front of the church to add a steeple would be $500,000. The family was approached to see if they would make up the difference. What do you think they said? No. Now what do you do with the $25,000 that's just sitting there? When they approached the family about, can we use it for something like a steeple communicates? A steeple communicates. Here we are. We're the church. We're here to serve you. Can we use it for that area underneath the steeple that we call the gathering area or narthex, whatever term you want to use, to be able to enhance it for hospitality, for people coming in? The family said no. Build a steeple. When a steeple wasn't built within 5 years, they left the church. They had to go to court, spend legal fees to be able to release the $25,000. They ended up with a net of about 10 by the time they were done. Make sure you talk to the church about if you're thinking about an individual endowment fund, or if you're thinking about leaving it for a specific purpose for one of the other 3 funds, and make sure it's something that will be beneficial long-term in the life of the church, or at least have a backup plan if it can't be used for that specific purpose at the time. Financial plan giving thoughts, don't delay. If you haven't already established a will or set up your estate, do so now, don't wait. Put it on your calendar. If you have a phone with you, put it on your calendar for tomorrow to call your attorney. If you don't have an attorney, call some friends and ask who their attorney is that they use to set up their estate. Put it on your calendar and get it done. And if you do have one, review it if you haven't done so recently. Invest in the kingdom. There's creative giving for current operations, and it creates a legacy for the long-term future in the life of the church. So, they told me to leave time for questions, did I? About 5 minutes, I believe. I believe you have cards in front of you. on the table. If you want to write it down, you can. If you prefer just to stand up and ask a question, please feel free to do so. I should have left out one story, and then I would have given you more time for questions. What questions do you have? Maybe this is all basic to you. It's very likely you all have gone through this process. And the one thing for some of you that you may need to do, that will be essential for you to do, is go home and review what you set up 10 years ago. If you walk away with nothing but that, that's worthwhile. If you walk away from here and you remember you did not remember the church in your estate plans, since I'm not from this church, I can say it strongly. I strongly encourage you to remember the church in your estate planning. It perpetuates a mission that has touched your life, transformed your life, supported you in the difficult times, celebrated with you in the good times, and you have the opportunity of perpetuating and making sure that your children and your grandchildren and your neighbors' grandchildren have a place in which they can learn more about what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. So please, if you haven't remembered the church, please do so. Questions? It wasn't that good. You just heard me say I'm not a professional, so why ask him? That's why. Yes?
Does endowment giving take away from the opportunity for people to tithe regularly?
Does endowment giving take away from the opportunity for people to tithe regularly? Remember, first mile giving is what we give to the church regularly. Anything in our estate giving, in the estate can go into the endowment, but we can also give to the endowment now, but that needs to be, the term I use, a second mile giving. Now, one of the reasons some people don't like endowments is they say it causes people to think they've got all those assets, they don't need my money. And is that more at the heart of your question? I kind of wonder. My response is, number one, this is a God issue. It's not a how much does the church have money issue. It's a God issue. What is my relationship with God like? If I want to continue to improve and enhance my relationship with God, I'm giving to God. I'm not giving to the church specifically. I'm not giving to the pastor. I'm not giving to the endowment. I'm giving to God for God to use as God deems as necessary for St. Andrew's in this time and place. Endowments don't give you that flexibility long term or short term. Long term, endowments are going to become more and more critical in the life of the church. If you were born before 1946, you typically are a regular, consistent giver to the church. If you're my age, it took a few years to get you to the point where you had confidence that, because we don't believe in institutions. After all, they got us into Vietnam. And as a result, we don't trust institutions. So the boomers have a tendency to say, when I trust the institution, then I'll give to the institution. And when we finally get to that place where we're giving, we're faithful givers and good givers. The next generation, and this is where endowments become important. The typical process of moving from a consumer that walks into a church and says, decent sermon, decent music, I'll pull a 20 out of my wallet and put it in the offering plate, to the point where I begin to think about tithing, for my generation and older, takes about 5 years. The next generation is more skeptical of institutions. They like to be involved, not give. Their involvement gets them to the point where they trust the people around them. As they begin to trust the people around them, they begin to think about participating in other ways, including giving, and that process is now 7 to 8 years. To move a person from a consumer to a follower of Jesus Christ that tithes. Endowment income is going to be critical to maintain the same ministry levels as you did before, because it's going to take longer to get young people to the point of giving at the same levels that boomers and or the builders are currently giving. So endowments becomes a means by a stopgap until people mature to the level of discipleship of giving. In addition, endowments can be that additional source of income that allows you to do ministry that can be new, and as a result, where do you begin to get the funds from it? Endowment income can be a great asset for challenging individuals, so that, for example, for a capital campaign, it might have been possible. I worked with one church where the endowment matched every dollar that each donor gave. So if a person gave $500, they really gave $1,000. So they felt like they were giving, instead of $1, $2. And the endowment was important as a part of that. Endowments need to enhance mission and ministry, and when they're utilized to enhance mission and ministry, and there's good education about how it's being used for that purpose, then people will continue to give on a regular basis with education and understanding the purpose of endowments. We understand endowments and foundations for hospitals and for universities. How's a church any different? It's to sustain the future, and it's to have assets necessary if we had an immediate need, but it really is to enhance mission and ministry today. If you needed a new staff person and you didn't have it in the budget, what would stop you from going to the foundation or to the endowment and saying, we need to have this new staff person and it's going to cost X number of dollars? Let's talk about how some of those funds can be utilized while we talk to the congregation about the position and how it can help and grow the life and ministry of our church. And a typical new staff person, within 2 years, they're paying for themselves. So the endowment is a stopgap while you're using, during that time that that person is getting themselves established in the life of the church. That sometimes it applies to nobody in this room. Sometimes we use the fact that the church has an endowment as an excuse not to have to give. They've got money, they don't need mine. Well, it's between you and God about your relationship with God and your giving to God. So the critique comes from God, not from the church. And remember, it's about your relationship with God and your discipleship, not about whether the church has an endowment or not. Now, you've got to be careful with endowments. They can become so rigid. I'm aware of one church that had $12 million in endowments. They had 25 people in worship. Does 25 in worship sustain a full staff? Because this was a downtown church that was huge, had all kinds of ministries, all kinds of staff, huge building that required a lot of maintenance. The endowments were essential. But 25 people? They were known for having organ recitals at noon downtown. What does that tell you about ministry? The pastor freed up $2 million to do an advertising campaign, and within 2 years they had 250 people in worship. And they had business people from the local offices coming in at noon to have lunch over a Bible study. Endowments enable you to do that during times of crisis. There's a lot of ways that we don't think about endowments other than, why do I have to give? And I often, and again, doesn't apply to anybody here, we use endowments as an excuse to not have to give out of my own pocket for some individuals. In some churches, not in Findlay. Okay, other questions? Good question. Thank you. Am I too far over? We're okay?
Thank you, Reverend Cooper. Excellent presentation. What will happen, if you noticed, we have someone that's, Deb's recording the comments that you made today.
Oh.
So we will have those in perpetuity. And what that means is that if you are so interested at any point, we'll have a copy for you. There'll be a time for you to acknowledge that you might want a copy. And if that's the case, that's great. And that's why we're doing this. Okay. Anyway, thank you for attending. We appreciate your attendance here. There's literature at your place. If you'd like to have a copy, please pick it up and take it with you. And if you would help for the next group coming in, if you would kind of bust the table and leave, that'd be terrific. Thank you very much.
Straighten up and fly right.
Get rid of your coffee cup.
Yeah, yourself.